Hello, thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, in Oxford, England, and my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar, in Washington, D.C., to this jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University, and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford University. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project, to introduce today's distinguished panel and to moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the Q&A session. From the start and throughout the discussion, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. These will come to me during the session, and I will try to put them into a logical order for the panel to consider. We urge you, please, to ask questions. Any that can't be answered today, we will try to answer later by email. I hope you enjoy the talks and the discussion. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Mike. Delighted to be together again for one of our transatlantic dialogues. And we do have a distinguished panel indeed today. Let me introduce them very briefly before we get into our discussion. Baroness Usha Prashar of Runnymede, a crossbench or independent member of the British House of Lords since 1999, is with us. She has been deeply involved in human rights and race relations issues throughout her career, and including with the European community. We also have Nirmal Ghosh, who is the U.S. Bureau Chief for the Straits Times of Singapore, a distinguished English language newspaper, the leading newspaper in that part of the world, I may say, and currently residing in Washington. We also have Professor Peter Rona, Fellow and Director of the Las Casas Institute's Economics Program, former Director of the Bank of Hungary, and a distinguished resident of Hungary, the United States, and the United Kingdom over the years. Also, Gail Leftwich-Kitch, who is a consultant on civic engagement based in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is in some respects ground zero for free speech issues in the United States in recent years. And most of you have known about that. We'll get right into our discussion. I'd like to turn first to Baroness Prashar and ask whether we have passed the point where societies are abiding by the ethical and educational obligation to document and preserve a reasonable consensus view of their own history. There seems to be a war over history and over interpretation of what people have experienced. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about how this has come about and how we're going to deal with it.
Thank you, Sandy, for that very interesting question. History, in my view, is something which is not constant. It is a process. It's very complex, and it should be looked at from very multidimensional points of view. And of course, we have reached a point where I think there is a lot more challenge and there is a lot more pressure to begin to look at history from different perspectives, and quite rightly so too, because in an age where the world has become very interconnected and people are moving around and begin to see the impacts of what has happened historically, it's becoming almost imperative that we look at history from different perspectives. Now, how has that come about? I mean, from my perspective of living in the UK, I think that the process of migration has meant that people have begun to challenge the fact that their experience of history is not part of the curriculum. Because there's a saying, when minorities came here, they say, we are here because you were there. So in that sense, the interconnectedness begins to work. And I mean, I was born in Kenya, where history was very much taught from the British perspective, you know, and when I came to study in the UK, for me, history was really seen from the point of view of the colonies, what the British did, you know, how Africa, scramble for Africa, how it was divided and so on. But very later understanding from different perspectives. And of course, over the years, we have begun to see things like the the Black History Month, for example, which was basically to recognize that there are different perspectives and you cannot brush out the most uncomfortable parts of your history. So I do think that it's important that now we begin to come to terms and recognize that history is multidimensional. There are different perspectives to it. And how, it doesn't matter how uncomfortable the past is, how savage it was. To me, it's important that people really understand. And as someone said, you know, you cannot begin reconciliation by actually brushing out history. And therefore, if you've got to begin to live together, have a better understanding, it's extremely important that history is taught from all different perspectives. And there's a recognition of however uncomfortable or what happened in the past. And of course, in the recent months, you know, this has really come to the fore following the Black Lives Matter. But it has been an issue which has been around for a pretty long time in my career of working in race relations in the UK, where we've been arguing for a very long time that the curriculum should take proper account of history from different perspectives.
Thank you. Peter Rona, Central and Eastern Europe have been through a quite turbulent time in the last, well, we can calculate it different ways, 50 to 75 years. And especially in the post-communist era, there have been many changes. And we see now that someplace like Poland, for example, has passed a law regulating historical memory. It is forbidden in Poland, in fact, punishable in a very serious way, to suggest that the way some people remember things is actually true, that to suggest that there were people in Poland who collaborated with the Nazis in World War II who were accomplices in the Holocaust. And I wonder where all that stands and how it's going to settle down, and will people be able to state their accurate memory of what's happened?
Well, of course, laws like that, and also there are similar trends at play in Hungary as well, are very unfortunate and unhelpful. However, they are indications, manifestations of a profound sense of frustration and deep, deep disappointment, particularly in these two countries, Poland and Hungary, who have been the great losers of European history for the past, 200 years or so. They experienced the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the departure of communism with enormous enthusiasm, expecting to be turning into Western-style democracies and so on and so forth. And things did not work out for very complex reasons that I think we are still grappling with and are not fully understanding. The fact of the matter is that the change that has taken place has been deeply disappointing. And there is a very strong feeling that once again, the West is in some way letting down these two countries. You see, in terms of East Central Europe, there is a distinct distinction between Poland and Hungary on the one hand, and the other countries, Czechia, Slovakia, Romania, and the Balkans on the other, or on the third hand, the Balkans are a special case. But these three groupings are quite different, and although there are similarities, in terms of analyzing these similarities, it is a mistake to group them into one. What became Czechoslovakia was one of the great winners of Versailles. Romania was a great winner of Versailles. Poland had been, as you will recall, partitioned by the European power 3 times. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territories in Versailles and 40% of its population for really no reason, because that's how the cookie crumbled, as it were. Then came the Second World War and its decision to hand the region over to Stalin in Yalta through the good offices of Britain, France, and the United States, but particularly Britain and the United States. So there are deep, deep wounds and some very sore points here at play that, unfortunately, as most traumas, this one plays out with unhealthful and unhealthy effects.
Nirmal Ghosh, the region in Asia that was once so influenced by the British Empire has also had, one part of and influenced by the British Empire, has also had a great deal of turmoil over its history, and the history in particular of the British East India Company, that has not had so much attention in Europe and in the United States. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, well, during the battle for India's independence and shortly after independence as well, there was a lot of sustained attention in India given to the sort of vestiges of empire. Statues were defaced, statues of British officers and generals and so forth have been defaced. And I remember I was a little boy in Delhi in the 60s, and oddly enough, one of my vivid memories is of the statue of George V being removed from India Gate. And I think, in fact, India handled it fairly well. Because they removed a bunch of these colonial era statues and put them in a sort of obscure park somewhere outside Delhi, which I've not been to, where they are, sort of overgrown by shrubbery and whatnot, and pigeons sit on their heads, things like that. So I think India did that quite well. But in recent years, there has been a revived debate about it, and a lot of credit should go to the Oxford Union, which organized a debate on it in 2015, where the politician, but more aptly public intellectual Shashi Tharoor made a speech which sort of went viral in India and all that, and he talked about reparations. So the big issue is acknowledgement versus glorification, and putting up statues of former slaveholders and colonialists in public spaces is glorification, really. And for those who are at the receiving end of that sort of behavior, they simply want to reclaim the space. And it also goes down to, I think, having come to the States 4 years ago and having been to Charlottesville, I'm very interested in what Gail has to say. It also goes down to the question of justice, whether there is restorative justice, not retribution, but not retribution necessarily at all, but whether there's restorative justice, whether there are reparations and so forth. So, that basically, I think, is the crux of the matter. I remember in Charlottesville, I spoke to a lady over there who said, oh, well, it's a Confederate general statue. It's just part of the scenery. We walk by it every day. We don't even notice. And then I spoke to an African-American activist friend of mine who said, no, to the contrary, when we walk by that statue, it is a reminder every day of the past. And of course, as we know, sitting in the States, in recent months, recent years, in fact, there has been this sort of pressure or controversy about the quote unquote erasure of the past and so forth, or we should not be ashamed of our past. But, again, it goes back to acknowledgement versus, glorification. Acknowledging the past is not to be ashamed of it. I mean, you can be ashamed of it and acknowledge it at the same time. The issue really is glorification and reclaiming the public space from these symbols of sort of past glories or something, which came at the expense of entire societies, entire civilizations, entire countries. And going back to that 2015 debate, that did spark a lot of continuing discussion in India about it, the question of reparation. I mean, the figures are just staggering, of course. I mean, the British Empire, Britain's power grew from exploiting the colonies, and a large chunk of those colonies was in India. I mean, there's no two ways about it. The data is absolutely stunning. And fast forward a bit to the current movement to remove the statue of Robert Clive, who was fancifully called Clive of India, which is, tragically ironic. And Clive himself was actually quite hated and despised for the amount of loot he amassed from his, his colonization of his part in the colonization of India. And thousands have signed the petition to remove his statue from Whitehall. Historians like William Dalrymple have supported it, and yet nothing has happened as far as I know, which is a bit of a mystery to me because, again, I think his statue was put up years, even up to 100 years after he had died. And he was a reviled man. I mean, so Britain loses nothing by acknowledging this about Robert Clive, which is, and I mentioned Clive because that statue is a center of much debate now.
Gail Kitch, speaking of Charlottesville, there you are, really in some ways the center of all of this. And of course, what lies beneath a lot of the ongoing debate in the US is the kind of re-litigation of some sort, reenactment of the American Civil War. And I think you've been looking at this issue of statues and monuments and in your community engagement efforts there. And I wonder where you think this is heading.
I think it's worthwhile to sort of step back, and it actually fits into our conversation about reinterpreting history and have a context for the conversation by understanding what the role of these monuments, statutes, particularly those connected with the Confederacy, what they represent, and sort of the passage of time, the different roles they've played, and the way that these statues have been used as vehicles, which is really the point. It's sort of an interesting issue. They're tools, basically. They're tools. Just a little bit of context. First of all, there are 1,800 of this, and the Southern Poverty Law Center documents this, so that's a source. So as of September, there are 1,800 symbols of the Confederacy. These are bridges, schools, parks, et cetera. We've all been talking, renaming schools, renaming bridges, et cetera. And among those, 830 are monuments, statues. The statues are spread across 31 states. Now, 22 of those states didn't even exist at the time of the Civil War. So to understand right away, thinking about putting Civil War statues, monuments in states that didn't even have any participation in the Civil War already sort of undermines the argument about what their role is. But from the historical sweep standpoint, the fact is that after the Civil War, in the very early years after the Civil War, the only monuments that existed were a few monuments in some towns where there had been battles, and they were actually monuments to those who had died from that town. There was not a vast sort of, construction of monuments to any of the sort of generals who had lost or whatever. Basically, folks had sort of gone home, because they could, because of the nature of the negotiated settlement of the Civil War. Union folks went home, took their horses, had their guns. The Confederates went home, Union went home. Everybody kind of went, it's over now. So then slowly over time, as we got into the mid-1800s, basically there was an effort to sort of sort of systematically rewrite what had happened, since there had been no sort of closure ultimately in the war with a sort of, there was a defeat, but it wasn't the kind of resounding acknowledged defeat. And there was lingering, obviously, the slave owning states got to go back to having their plantations. I mean, yes, there had been the emancipation population, but still they still got to sort of go back to try to reclaim their way of life. So over time, there was a systematic effort, and ultimately aided by the Daughters of the Confederacy, to reclaim the narrative and to use statues as a vehicle for doing this. So the first wave of significant construction of Confederate statues took place, basically 400 of them, so half of what's out there, were constructed between the late 1800s and the early 1900s in a systematic effort to buttress and complement what was going on with the rise of Jim Crow laws in response to enfranchisement of the formerly emancipated Black male slaves. Of course, women didn't get it, but Black males. You had Black people running and winning office. So there was a systematic effort to push back against this and to basically create a lost cause mythology. So there was an effort abutted, as I said, basically assisted by the construction of statues and memorials to create a story of some long ago time that was better, and everybody just was happy in their roles, to recreate sort of what it was that the war was actually about, brother fighting brother. There was really no issue. The slavery thing was not even discussed. All of these folks were happier then because, of course, they'd been, after the Civil War, and as we got into Jim Crow laws, they were stripped of any sort of effort to have any kind of economic productivity or well-being. And then slowly you had political power also stripped away from the newly enfranchised slaves and other free Blacks. So then you had the whole process of the lost cause narrative, creating a kind of woozy, gauzy time that supported an argument that this was really just a misunderstanding and everybody should just sort of all just get along and celebrate a time when things were better. So in fact, as I said, the statues then were a vehicle for buttressing that argument and sending a message to the newly enfranchised Blacks and other free Blacks that you're actually not, that this is the way the world's going to be, and you need to understand what your place in it is going to be. So it supported lost cause. There was simultaneously then a rise in the Ku Klux Klan. So in fact, this construction of the sort of intense construction of the statues was also accompanied by the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which increasingly gained power in the 1880s and 90s. A rise in lynchings. Basically, there were, over this sort of late 19th century period, there were about 2,500 lynchings. So there was violence. There was then the statue, which then told you that this is what the story was going to be, and this was really about white supremacy taking over, and the lost cause reinforcing it. So we had Birth of a Nation, we had Gone with the Wind. The kind of gauzy Gone with the Wind story is the embodiment of what that represented. And the statues, the creation of the statues and the monuments just aided that. So that carried on into, and of course, this was then in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. So the Daughters of the Confederacy were sort of building into this time we were all just going to come together. And then also I had read something which made the point that this also, as we got into the early 20th century, also coincided with a period of going into the Spanish, basically trying to have everybody come together around the Spanish-American War. So that was a whole other piece of this as well. So it was really everybody was just going to get along in a sort of sign of coming together, and you Black people just go away and don't upset the apple cart, as it were. So then we get into World War I, and you had Blacks and sort of more of a rise in sort of questioning, certainly on the part of Blacks, many of whom were going to go fight in the war or were in fact supporting the effort in World War I, and just a general sort of why were people fighting for freedoms while in general we're talking about freedom, while in our own country we were obviously not supporting those kinds of principles. So there was another sort of rallying around civil rights and the notion of addressing sort of this issue of white supremacy and ensuring that Blacks really were getting the rights they deserved. And that was then another wave of statue construction at the time. So you had the first wave, which was the largest. You then have the second wave of statues being built to, and again, send a message that there's not going to be legal change here. You should understand what your place is and just don't upset anything. So that was another sort of early 20s, 30s, 40s. because as Blacks were beginning to sort of, especially going to the 30s and 40s, as you're beginning to have people ask for rights. So that was another opportunity to send a message that this is a white supremacy, this is the white supremacy reigns, there's no place for you. And then another wave, of course, all along it's been going on, but then there was a final additional wave. I was struck by this, even the infamous, oh darn, what is it? Stone Mountain carving in Georgia, which is the largest Confederate sort of monument that exists. It's
and it's a glorification.
Right, it's a glory, exactly. That was dedicated in like 1968 or something. In other words, that had been, so in other words, even then, you still had this sort of push to remind people where they stood in the firmament after the civil rights acts were passed, because of course that was a huge upheaval as well. There was yet another effort to send messages that said, this is the way the world is, and this is the only, and to claim the spaces. What's interesting, and then I'll wrap up on this point about using memorials, monuments, statues to reinforce that it is a white space, was that most of the monuments built in the 20th century were built at courthouses. So that was built in response to using the law as a vehicle to exercise rights. So you ended up having, as was the case, to bring it back to Charlottesville, the Johnny Reb statue that was on the courthouse in Charlottesville. So anybody walking into the federal courthouse had to walk past a statue of a Confederate soldier with his gun at his side and other Daughters of the American Revolution, put up in the 20th century, sending a message that even the law was going to be used as a tool of white supremacy. So that's sort of the context for this, and goes right to your comment, Nirmal, about the differing perceptions of what it is that the role of these monuments and statues is.
So I think to broaden this out a bit, and I'd like to bring everybody in to the conversation together, we find now in the UK, even two figures who are so have been thought of as iconic, important people in the evolution, not just of the United Kingdom, but really internationally, and hero of Second World War, even Winston Churchill and then Cecil Rhodes, who's of course a bit more understandable. How is it that even Rhodes and Churchill can be in question now? Baroness Pritchard.
Well, I think you single out two most recent ones. I mean, Churchill and Cecil Rhodes controversy, as you know, has been going on for pretty some time. And Churchill's statue in Parliament Square was, of course, dubbed following the Black Lives Matter issue. And I think, to me, the focus on statues is actually a diversion, because it is more about acknowledging history and looking at it from a multidimensional point of view, because it's a space people who have lived in the UK, who've come here from colonies, want to recognize the role of slavery, the role of these leaders in colonialism, so that they feel they're an inclusive, legitimate part of society. And therefore, I think for me, it's more a question, how do you handle these debates? Because I have been chairing a task force of contested histories in public spaces project for the last 2 years. And it's funded by the International Bar Association in London. And it's probably the first study worldwide looking at 10 case studies across the world to see how different people have actually handled this. And this will be released early in 2021, because what we've looked at is what are the principles which underpin this, and what are the processes people need to engage, and what is the best practice. Because as I said earlier, it is very, very much about what underlies some of these issues. Because, for example, people forget that Churchill's statue was there in Parliament Square for a number of years. But a few years ago, Gandhi's statue was put alongside his in Parliament Square, the very man he called the naked fakir. And we got Mandela in the same Parliament Square as well. Now the question comes is, how do you begin to actually reconcile some of these issues? And as you know, Gandhi has become a controversial figure in West Africa. So the point really is, it's how do you handle these debates? How do you educate public opinion? How you engage people in the debate? And what do you do with these? Now, Colston was pulled down by angry people who have been arguing for a very long time for removal of Colston in Bristol. Nobody listened. And the anger, rightfully, meant that it was dislodged by very angry people. Now, if the local authority had engaged in a public debate about it, and it had been put in a museum with explanations and so on, so it's a question of the fact that people want recognition of the fact that these people don't just have a glorified past. Everybody has a negative side to them. And I mean, Churchill's role in relation to India is very controversial. And Nirmal mentioned Clive of India. All these issues are there. And it's a question of coming to terms with your history. Now, I'm of the view that history, as I said earlier, is a process. It evolves. Statues are set in concrete. Now, I would actually question, should we in future have statued in public places at all? Or should we be using public spaces in a much more of a creative manner to engage people in debates, like in Trafalgar Square, they've got a plinth and they ask the public to see what they would like on that plinth. And that changes over a period of time. So I think it's a question of recognizing this. But just to focus on statues, I think takes you away from some of the fundamental issues that you cannot actually project only one perspective of history. It is actually a symptom of something much deeper. And it's minorities coming into the UK are saying we are an integral part of our society, recognize us and recognize our perspective and how it all came about. And one thing which is good as that's happened is that now each city, each local authority is beginning to look at all the statues or monuments in their particular areas. The National Trust has come under a lot of controversy, because they've begun to see, how the wealth was used on these stately buildings. So it's actually raised that debate, and people are beginning to question, and it's raising awareness. But what I would like to see much more of, also a change in the school curriculum, in the way the history is actually taught. So I just think we have to begin to move forward to see how do we deal with this controversy, actually bring about a better dialogue. How do we begin to see how we teach history, and also to take into account different perspectives and present history from different points of view.
It sounds almost as if what has to take place is a process of negotiation. And I wonder, I'd like some other people to weigh in on this. How do we negotiate a solution, if that's what it's all about, to something so contentious and so difficult to wrestle into place? Peter, Nirmal, how do you?
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that one major issue, as you say, is how to negotiate some kind of a modus vivendi. And in some sense, one of the things that is going on is how to reinsert or to insert into this existing paradigm, social, economic, and political paradigm, people hitherto excluded from it. There is, however, another thing going on, which is far more serious, and that is a growing sense, or certainly a growing claim, that the liberal democratic model doesn't work, that it doesn't do what it was sold to be doing, that it always served a privileged white upper class, its interests, and its glories have been bought on the back of people who were oppressed, and that therefore it is morally bankrupt, and that therefore the thing to do is to remove from public space, among other things. I mean, one of the things that should be done is to remove the accoutrements of this liberal democratic paradigm, the symbols, its messages, so forth. Not just the sculptures, but the statues, but also other things. That is the more radical proposition, the proposition that the liberal democratic model is not going to be able to solve income inequality, wealth inequality, the distribution problem in economics. It is not even interested in solving that problem. It is not going to solve the environmental issues. It is not going to solve, the most fundamental issues relating to human dignity and welfare. And therefore it has to go. Now the problem, of course, with that is that no one quite knows what should follow it.
Right. Where it goes.
Where it goes, yes. But it is fueled by a very deep sense of frustration. And what's interesting about it is that deep sense of frustration manifests itself on the right, on the extreme right. You cited the Polish example, and there are Hungarian examples, and there are examples in France, and there have been examples in the United Kingdom, right-wing examples of great frustration with the existing system, and of course on the left, with the middle getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I think that in writing history and in rewriting and rethinking history, I totally agree with Baroness Usha that it is a question of a multifaceted approach in interpreting and relating history, and to include as many points of view as possible in all of that. But there's a deeper challenge here. There's a deeper challenge here, and that deeper challenge is a restatement of what our fundamental humanity is all about, as a point of departure for understanding what has gone wrong over time up until today.
Nirmal, where do you think the next step lies? Is there a conceivable path of negotiation around these things? You have just lived through this extraordinary election in the United States, presidential election, which leaves things perhaps as confused as possible, and I think has profound implications for the whole issue of free speech. What is the truth? How do we arrive at a consensus truth, if that's what it is?
I have to say I'm somewhat pessimistic. I mean, it's the old saying, right, that you don't learn from history, you're condemned to repeat it, and we have countless examples of that. And that's not just in human history writ large. It's every successive human generation actually has to learn, right, from experience, and it repeats the same things again and again. This endless cycle. At the risk of sounding very sort of philosophical and metaphysical, it's the endless cycle, right? So we had a Holocaust, then you had the genocide in Rwanda, you had the genocide in Cambodia, you had Yugoslavia, and there's plenty of examples of that. And I think that the teaching of history has to be reformed. Teaching of history has to be made a little more alive, so to speak. And it's a pity, because we have the tools now at our disposal. We have the internet, and we have the rest of that technology, which and tremendous strides have been made using the current information technology to bring history alive. But at the same time, the same technology, the same platforms are used by reactionary and elements and so forth to do what Gail and Baroness Usha have been referring to, which is to reclaim some sort of mythical good old days of the past and so forth. And I think that is the central irony of the situation. I can't help being somewhat pessimistic, because as a journalist, of course, one sort of covers the bad news all the time, really. So unfortunately, that's part of the job. But yeah, I think the teaching of history has to be paid. I mean, much more attention has to be paid to the teaching of history in schools and universities and so forth. And I think that there will always be forces like white supremacy, for example. There will always be forces, nationalist forces, whether they come as ethnic nationalism or religious nationalism. There will always be forces trying to sort of seize reclaim the ground perceived to have been lost, or perceived working against some kind of perceived threat. If you look at Burma, for example, the rise of Buddhist nationalism in Burma is based on what? It's based on a myth, really, that there's this huge hordes of Muslims who are going to take over this country, when Muslims actually, I don't want to get into that debate because it's a rabbit hole, but I mean, they're only like 8 or 10% of the population. And it's all a myth, right? It's all a complete myth. Likewise in the States, actually, I find a lot of the fear element in the States, the fear of some foreign power coming to destroy one's way of life and so forth. Demagogues and nationalist leaders feed on this fear. They sow the fear, they feed on it. And that's how they sort of mobilize certain sections of the population to grab power, right? So I think there's a lot of work. This is a continuing struggle. I think understanding history, and there's nothing to negotiate about history. History is history. It has to be understood as such. And I think the teaching of history has to be made much more vibrant, much more immediate for people, so that, because this goes to sort of visceral issues, right? Ethnicity, conflict, tribalism, and so forth. These have to be fully understood, because history as it is taught now is, it sort of passes people by. I find people, I worked in Thailand for 13 years. I find so many examples of young people in Thailand who have no idea what happened during the Holocaust. They have been taught a couple of chapters in history that this happened, but they don't really grasp it. They have no idea. So I think much more attention has to be paid to learn from history, but at the same time, not condemn people out and condemn entire sort of populations out of hand. I've heard people in America say, "Oh, my great-grandfather, my grandfather would have fought for the Confederate. He's a hero. His portrait is in the house and all that. How can I be ashamed of him?" Well, sorry, but times change.
Thank you. Just very, very quickly, Gail, before I turn things back over to Mike Scott, do you foresee some kind, with the change that's about to occur in the United States in terms of who's in power, nominally in power, in a short period of time, do you see a kind of pause of the tension? So this could be, some progress could be made. Just quickly, please.
I'm not even, I think because of, in fact, building on what Nirmal said, all of us said, I think actually, yes, but, because I think this conversation actually has to be from the bottom up rather than from the top down. Yes, a context can be set. So at least perhaps we can strip away some of what's been feeding and firing up some of the emotions to sort of DEFCON whatever, to mix various metaphors. But I think at the end of the day, the conversation, which is really difficult, even the history conversation, right? You have to talk about things in which people have to potentially confront losing sort of things they hold dear, conflicting values, sort of everybody can't be a winner, I guess. I mean, you can, but it's sort of seen as a win-lose, zero-sum game. But that negotiation has to take place on the ground locally, and people have to really listen to each other. I mean, that sounds corny, but it's listening to each other. Just to sort of connect it back to the monuments conversation, there's an observation that in America in particular, we sort of have the statues that monuments that you build to progress, right? So you think about the Washington Monument, you think about, you know, the Lincoln Memorial, even the Jefferson Memorial. These were built, of course, they weren't built when these men were alive or even died. These were built later to celebrate a kind of progress notion for what America represented. That's the sort of classic version of statue represents progress. Versus in tension with statue being used to control. Although even in the progress, because of this issue that we've been talking about, because so many people feel left out of that conversation about what progress is, you almost undermine that, because it's really sort of who was actually part of the decision to build that statue? What is being celebrated? How was the decision made to celebrate that particular person, idea, whatever? And so I feel like the statues become a tool for having those conversations about what does this mean for you, the individual? And that's where the conversation has to take place, whether it's the name of a school, a statue, a road, you know, whatever. But I think it's going to end up having to be a local conversation.
Mike Scott, time to sort this out a little bit with some of the other people who have been listening and thinking and sending us questions.
Fine, thank you very much. And what a fascinating debate we've been having today. Let me start with a question from Aaron, who says, how does multiple views of history interact with or even conflict with the idea of a single factual history?
Who wants to take that on?
Yeah, well, you know, just a very short comment, and you know, one country or one ethnic group's hero is the other's villain, right? I mean, if you go Genghis Khan in Mongolia, it's got this huge statue in Sukhbaatar Square in Ulaanbaatar, and you know, Genghis Khan is Mongolia's great national hero. What can you do about it, you know? But I think acknowledging the history again is important, because it does not mean that you are personally shamed by that history. If you look at individuals, for example, look, I mean, just if I may be allowed a short subjective digression, I work in wildlife conservation. I do a lot of work in wildlife conservation. That's my other life. My father was a hunter. The first early generation of wildlife conservationists were basically hunters, because they knew what was going on. So they recognized it and changed and became conservationists. Where, I mean, you across America, across Europe, across Asia, that has always been the case. I'm not personally ashamed of it. There's no need to be ashamed of it. You know, those were completely different times. And the fact that they changed, that generation sort of changed and became advocates for wildlife conservation, environmental conservation, and so forth is a credit to them. So I think when one teaches history, the facts are the facts, incontrovertible. If someone sort of slaughtered thousands of people in another country in the name of nationalism or empire or loot and all that, that's just a fact. It doesn't mean that his ancestors should feel to be made personally responsible for what their ancestors did. I think that is wrong. I mean, that puts people's backs up. It puts people into their own little silos when they feel defensive, and that creates a lot of conflict, which is completely different from the question of, say, reparations. Now the Australians have apologized for the treatment of the natives in Canada. Before, in universities in Canada, when they have conversations, panel discussions, they say we occupy land which was once belonged to such and such tribe, which was taken over illegally by colonizers. So some of that tokenism is there. And tokenism is a somewhat negative word, but at least it's there. So you can do these things without feeling personally affronted and having to apologize and defend some distant ancestor who did something which he thought was right at the time, but we all live and learn and we realize that it wasn't.
Well, can I just take that a little bit further, because there's a follow-up question from Aaron that says, what is an example of acknowledgement versus glorification from your perspective?
Well, I mean, glorification is obviously all these monuments and statues, right? I mean, you can acknowledge one's own, if you are the perpetrator of colonialism, right? If you have a history of perpetrating slavery or colonialism, it has the paradox about America is that everybody expects America to have dealt with all this because it is an open society, and you can have this sort of conversation sitting in DC and on the streets anytime you want. But actually, it hasn't, as Gail said. I mean, it's quite amazing that Stone Mountain, Georgia, was dedicated in 1968. It's just stunning, right? So it hasn't actually. It's the illusion of progress, but there have been counter waves of it, trying to reclaim, trying to sort of re-emphasize the sort of perceived glories of the past. So I think the distinction is very clear. You can acknowledge all this without any detriment to oneself or to one's society, one's standing as a country, without glorifying. I mean, I don't like these statues anyway, as one of us, I think a couple of us said earlier. What is the point of a statue? I mean, if it's not a work, I mean, nobody's talking about Michelangelo's David, right? I mean, what is the point of statues which cater to people's egos when they themselves are long dead? I mean, so the whole thing is, it's quite unnecessary. So that's what I mean. I think you can very well acknowledge history, and it has been acknowledged. There are countless examples of history being acknowledged without glorifying it. Now, if someone does want to glorify it, and then the pushback starts, and you have an active debate like we are having now, or what has been going on in India, in the United States, and in England.
Can I just take it?
Can I come in, Mike, if I may?
Yes, I was going to ask you a question, but you do come in and then I'll ask you a question.
I just want to pick up the question about multidimensional and a fact. I mean, let me give a concrete example here. Now, Colston was revered in Bristol as someone who brought a lot of wealth to Bristol, right? But the fact is, nobody actually highlighted the fact that he was a very cruel slave trader, right? So in terms of looking at the person multidimensionally, that he may have brought wealth, but he actually did it by means which brought a lot of hardship. And therefore, I think, we've got to recognize that even the people we glorify always have a dark side to them. And therefore, it's recognizing the totality of it and glorification, and not just sort of building them as heroes. And but if you build them as heroes, children grow up thinking they were absolutely marvelous. Now, I just think we've got to begin to look at history from those different perspectives. That's the point I really wanted to clarify, what multidimensional means in terms of people. And it's not glorification without recognizing the wrong and the right sides of people. I mean, Churchill, a wonderful war leader, but his views and how he handled some of the things in India are controversial.
There was there was a very good, just a short introduction. There was a very good study done by Yale some years ago. And I think a friend of mine, Professor Glenn Altshuler of Cornell, wrote it up in The Hill recently. And they made the case that in evaluating all these sort of examples, monuments and statues and so forth, and inscriptions on buildings, they made the case that these historical figures should be perhaps evaluated for what could be considered their principal legacy. Like the Baroness just said, a lot of people have had their dark sides. What is the principal legacy? In terms of Colston, it's quite clear. In terms of some others, it may not be that clear. But these things can be debated, even subjected to referendums. I think that was an interesting thought which emerged from that Yale review some years ago.
To give
that's good that you mentioned referendum, because I was sorry, Gail, do you want to come in?
Let me make one quick comment because I think it's in your context. Abraham Lincoln is a really good example of that in America, and Frederick Douglass, who saw that about him during his lifetime. I mean, this came up when they were looking, just recently, they were looking at this Emancipation Monument in Washington, D.C., which has the cowering slave, which is very unappealing. But Douglass spoke at when that memorial was, whatever it's called, I can't remember now, in the early 70s, when that memorial was actually being sort of whatever, I can't remember what the correct verb is now. And Douglass spoke and alluded to Lincoln's less than appealing sides. But at the end of the day, Douglas respected what Lincoln did, and and as I think most do, even still, hence the very phenomenon we're talking about.
Great. Can I just ask, oh, Peter, I want to ask you a question that's come in from the audience. So, which is interesting because it just takes us to the present. And Claire Jenkins says, quite simply, is Brexit a reconstruction of empire?
Yes.
Do you want to elaborate at all?
Yes. No, but I mean, before we get to that, can I just, in a previous series of comments, just observe that one of the great pitfalls of historical writing, of constructing history, is to slip into a judgmental mode, as if the purpose of historical writing was to pass judgment on what happened before us. We are in that phase right now. We are extraordinarily judgmental about most everything, including the past. And we find that somehow our salvation, the salvation of our souls, our moral integrity, our being, is dependent on the formulation of appropriate judgments about the past. This has now gotten into a position which in my judgment, is very dangerous, because it is this judgmental mode of reasoning about our history is in large measure driving the division within society. That's just a comment on some of the things that have been said before. And in that context, I think it's worth noting that historic facts are not like scientific facts. There are very few historic facts that are, repeatable in a laboratory test, that are verifiable with a method independent of the circumstances of the fact, and so on and so forth. So the methodology of science for determination of facts is not useful to history and historic writing. History's facts are complex. They inherently do involve and contain an element of judgment, and they do involve the selection of facts that make the story that the historian constructs intelligible. Now, in terms of Brexit, which was your question.
Yes, let me just say, Peter, that looking from a literary critical point of view at history, we have to accept that it is always mediated through the ideology of the present, of the person who is reading, not of the person who is writing. But that leads us actually onto the current question of Brexit. And I'm sure Usher's dying to get in on this. I don't know, but Peter first.
Yes, no, I think that Brexit is an entirely reactionary move by England. Its popularity and its victory was an English construct, and it is highly reliant on the promise that a glorious past can be had again, paralleled by Trump's Make America Great Again sort of sloganeering. It is very unfortunate. It will have extremely serious consequences. It will alienate, it will probably lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom, and it will alienate England from the continent in a way that we have not seen for centuries. I think the continent, as I understand the continent, and I do travel around the continent, will never forgive England the Brexit mood. It is now holding its horses. It is trying to get it done and get it over with, but it is an immense betrayal of Europe. It weakens European defense and security. It weakens the European economy, and it tears apart the social fabric that Europe has been painstakingly trying to construct. The kind of commentary that has been running pro-Brexit and at the time and since is outright, anti-European in an extraordinary way, involving falsification of facts, involving the generation of false facts, of alternative realities, and so on and so forth. So Brexit is a very serious matter, a very, very unfortunate matter, one of the great tragedies of European history.
Can I move up to Usha? What do you want to say something about this, Usha?
I do indeed. I think Pete is right that Brexit at one level was very much a view of taking back control and reverting back to some glorious past. And of course, within that, there was a great deal of anti-migrant feelings as well. But having said that, I don't think that from the time Britain joined the European Union, or there was a full-hearted commitment to it. It's been an ongoing struggle, particularly within the Conservative Party, and therefore they've always had what I call a transactional relationship with Europe, whereas people within the European Union, other countries in Europe, have an emotional attachment to the project. But of course, referendum in itself makes things very simplified. And I think at the time it happened, it was very much a question of, this slogan, let's take control back, take back control, but also the fact that there was this view they wanted to go back to some kind of glorified past. And I think it really doesn't recognize the fact that an interconnected world, you have to give some control to other people to be able to sustain your sovereignty. So I think the question was the right one, and I agree with Peter.
Could I just bring in a follow-up question, which is in the news at the moment in Britain, is as to whether the Prime Minister should allow Scotland to have a referendum for independence should the Scottish Nationalist Party win the majority in the Scottish parliamentary elections.
Am I to Usha?
No.
Usha first.
Well, I think that okay.
Go on, Peter. Go on. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
okay.
go on, Peter. Yeah.
I think that the short answer to that is, well, what happens if they don't? I mean, it's not a question. It's a question, perhaps, in the minds of the Prime Minister and his confederates. But saying that they cannot have a referendum on being independent will only make them all the more willing to be independent by quite possibly illegal means. I mean, what if they proclaim their independence without a referendum? Because the opinion polls now run at, say, 80% in favor of independence. I mean, this is something England should know all about. There was once upon a time a declaration of independence, was there not? That did not wait for the British Parliament or the King to authorize a referendum about it. So okay.
Yes, of course, there's the Catalonia problem, but we won't go into that now. Just Baroness Prashar, just very briefly, because I want to get back to the United States and a question to Gail Kitch. What was your response to that?
Well, I would be very sad if we saw the breakup of United Kingdom, of course. Let me start from that. And that would be a very sad situation for me. But obviously, if there is a strong force on the ground in terms of people really pushing for it, and it depends how a number of things pan out in relation to Brexit and so on, I think the Prime Minister may well have no choice but to concede.
Mike, if I can join for 1 second here, the mischievous role of President Trump in the last 4 years with interfering in the the referendum in Britain over Rescott was very important, more I think than many people may have realized.
Let's register that. I think that's a very important point. Let's register it. I'm going to move on to Gail now and ask a question that's coming from Jill Raitt. Do you think the 1619 project and similar initiatives are moves to correct our perception of US history? It certainly helped me to a better understanding.
I think that's, yeah, I think that's a really important point. The willingness to actually put these difficult facts out there. This goes back to, you know, what we talked about earlier about history. I mean, history is just you could have this sort of narrow understanding of history today. It's just a series of events. But the interesting question becomes whose experience of those events are what define what it is that happened. So I feel like something like the 1619 project, people can quibble about whatever. I mean, you know, yes, slavery existed before 1619. It was kind of incorporated into America. So yes, you know, certainly whatever. But the fact is that we need to look at these facts that we hold in many cases dear for a lot of, you know, perfectly good human reasons, but to recognize that the experience of others, which is why going back to the comment about these conversations actually have to be done almost at the individual level, because you really have to understand someone else's experience of the same fact. So yes, I think that projects which force us to challenge what we think we know by telling us someone else's experience of the same set of facts are really important for creating space for us to have conversations about what history was. It's not, you're not asking people to change what happened, because those things happen. I mean, yes, it's not scientific, but a series of things happen. What you were doing is opening people up to at least recognizing that there were experiences that were very different of what the consequences of those actions were. So I think that that's critical, as opposed to it's not a politicization. It's not even, back to the comment, it's not judging or shaming. It's just acknowledging. And in many cases, we simply do not know, because our lives are lived in such, you know, unfortunately, we increasingly live in lives in which we don't ever understand other people's experiences because we don't live with them. We're not around them. So I think, yes, fabulous.
Gail, we have another question about shame. How do we deal with the shame of our history?
Yeah. If I could sort of make a stab at that, we've not mentioned Germany so far. I mean, Germany dealt with it. You cannot you know, hang a swastika flag out of your window in Germany, and the majority of the population doesn't want to. So I think Germany is an example of dealing very well with that history. Of course, there are reactionary forces and so forth, like everywhere else, but they did it very well, and it's a free society, and it was done. They preserved the evidence of the Holocaust, and, you know, the concentration camps and so forth is there for everyone to see. It's taught in schools. Yeah, it's a question of moral. It's a question of moral clarity, actually. I mean, you can debate something till the cows come home, and you will always find something to argue about. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about the Holocaust, when you're talking about genocide, slavery, it's a question of moral clarity, and there's no shame at all in recognizing that, as Germany proves it.
Nor is there a loss of power, right? I think about this dynamic as well. I actually spent some time doing some work in South Africa, and there's another good classic example of a society that actually confronted this issue head on. However, the thing I thought about coming out of it was, in some ways, what made it, quote, easier, that's not the correct phrase for it actually, but was that Blacks in South Africa were the majority and ultimately were empowered, you know? And it's an interesting question about the connection between the shame and kind of what's driving that, because I think there's a piece of this which is what I was saying earlier about this kind of perception of a zero-sum game, that to acknowledge the fact is to somehow shame is almost a cover for feeling that you've somehow lost power. And so then you need to actually explore the source of the shame, it seems to me. That shame in some cases moral clarity is a good one because it's a values piece. But I also think sometimes in some of those conversations of shame, it's the resistance to acknowledging because you feel like somehow there's going to be a loss of status, power, or something. And then that's what needs to be discussed, because that's really, that's sort of a recapitulation of what the very issue at hand is. It's some sort of power negotiation. But if you're committed to having a future together, you simply got to figure out a way to get to it. So.
Well, Claudio Calogero asks, history is used to pursue national interests, or even it is written to consolidate elites' interests. So who can write an unbiased account of historical facts? An example is the US liberating Europe from Nazi and fascism, whilst the same country was segregationist. Kind of duality that we have. I just mentioned that. Here's another one that's come in from Marjorie, unless anybody wants to come in on that. No, okay. One from Marjorie Forster, who's gone back to the Scottish question. The Scottish people fail to recognise how dependent the country is on funding from the UK. North Sea oil is running out, and what will happen to their country then? Again, a statement from somebody as a question. We're coming towards the end. However, Peter, go on, yes, please.
No, I think unfortunately you can expect, I mean, I agree that it will be a very sad day if and when the United Kingdom breaks up. It's not a good thing, and I don't look forward to it at all. However, I think that you can expect powerful forces that will want that to happen. That will want to have Ireland unified and be a very successful member of the European Union, and will want Scotland to join the European Union and be equally successful. I think that Scotland is a small country. In economic terms, it's not much of an issue for the European Union. So the European Union is in a much better position to support an independent Scotland than England is in a position to support Scotland as a member of the United Kingdom. That's the economic part of this story.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful time we've had this afternoon, and I'd like to thank everybody. My thanks to Baroness Usha Prashar, Professor Peter Rona, Gail Kitch, Nirmal Ghosh, and my colleague Sandy Ungar for what has been a stimulating discussion. And thanks also to the really stimulating questions that have come in. I've tried to put them together. I might have missed some. We will try to answer those questions one way or another by emails. I must thank my colleagues at Georgetown University, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. The President, Jack DeGioia, the Vice President of Global Affairs, Tom Banshoff, and the Dean of Georgetown College, Chris Chalenza. And may I just say, we wish Chris every good wish as he moves on from Georgetown this December. Also, our thanks to Yvonne Queck, our US Administrator, to Carrie Johnson and Jamie Moore-Callio for the Free Speech Project, and to our colleague Shimon Tong, who makes Zoom happen. At Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford, thanks to John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, Kinga Rona Gabnai, our UK Administrator. Thanks to all those who've asked questions. As I say, we will answer them if we can over the next couple of weeks. Thank you all.
Thank you indeed,
for
Mike.
attending for today's event. The next Free Speech Project, Zoom in association with the Future of the Humanities Project, will be on the 19th of January at the earlier time of 3 p.m. GMT and 10 a.m. EST. John Kampfner is one of our guests, and we will be discussing where is democracy working today. The next Future of the Humanities Project is on Tuesday, the 8th of December, when Professor John Drakakis will be talking about Turner's revolutionary play, in one sense, The Atheist Tragedy, written in 1611, in the Christian Literary Imagination series. So please join us for these events. Sandy, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say thank you very much, Mike, for another successful collaboration, and to all our panelists for giving of their time and ideas today as well.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm Professor Michael Scott. I'm Fellow and Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until the next time, take care and keep safe. Goodbye.